Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the show where we really try to get under the surface of complex topics and give you that fast-tracked, genuine understanding. And today, we're actually kicking off something new, an exciting series focused specifically on helping you master critical concepts for the CSWIP 3.1 Welding Inspector Exam. Think of it as, well, your personalized deep dive into that core knowledge. We want to get to the why behind the answers, making sure you're really prepped not just for the test, but, for the actual job.
That's exactly right. Our goal here really goes beyond just memorizing facts for an exam. We want you to leave with a deeper understanding. That's what separates a good inspector from a truly great one, right? So this series is all about getting that crucial knowledge down quickly, thoroughly, but with insights that are actually going to stick with you.
Couldn't agree more. So what we've done is pull together some, let's say, classic multiple choice questions, the kind of thing you'll definitely encounter. But like we said, we're not just going to give you the answer and move on. We'll unpack each one, look at the options, really make sure you grasp the principles underneath, and importantly, connect it to what happens out there in the real world. Okay, ready to jump in. Let's tackle this first one. Question number 1. In which of the following steels are you most likely to find H2-induced weld metal cracking after welding? Your options are A, low-carbon steel, B, high-strength low-alloy steel, C, austenitic stainless steels, or D, 1% nickel steel. Take a second. Where do you think this hydrogen-induced cracking issue is most likely to pop up?
Okay, the correct answer, the one you really need to know here, is B, high-strength low-alloy steel. Now, this concept, hydrogen-induced cracking, it's sometimes called cold cracking or hydrogen embrittlement. It's absolutely critical. A real potential silent killer in welds. These high-strength, low-alloy steels or HSLA steels, they're designed for superior strength, right? And they often get that strength through specific microstructures, think like martensite or bainite, that form when they cool down quickly after welding.
Right, and those microstructures, that's kind of the vulnerability, isn't it? So you're saying the very thing we want, the high strength, can actually make the steel more susceptible to this type of cracking if we're not careful.
Precisely. It's a bit of a paradox. Those hard, strong microstructures, they're particularly susceptible to hydrogen. See, hydrogen atoms, tiny little things that can get into the weld from moisture in your electrodes, maybe contaminants on the plate, even just humidity in the air. These atoms diffuse into those susceptible microstructures, and they tend to gather at places like grain boundaries or tiny internal flaws. When enough hydrogen gathers there, combined with the stress that's always present after welding, it drastically reduces the steel's ability to deform its ductility and then crack. And this can happen hours, sometimes even days after the welding is finished. So yeah, the stronger the steel, often the more careful you have to be about hydrogen. It's a real balancing act.
That's fascinating, the strength creating a hidden weakness. So just quickly, why are the other options less likely to have this specific problem? Low carbon steel, for instance.
Good question. Low carbon steel, option A, it's just much more ductile, more forgiving. Its microstructure doesn't trap hydrogen in the same way, and it's less sensitive to its effects. Hydrogen can often diffuse out more easily without causing cracking. Austenitic stainless steels, option C, they have a completely different crystal structure, what we call face-centered cubic, or FCC, and that structure is generally much more resistant to hydrogen embrittlement compared to the body-centered cubic, or BCC, structures common in HSLA steels. They can have other issues, but not typically this severe cold cracking. And the 1% nickel steel, option D. Well, nickel is an alloying element, sure, but its susceptibility really depends on the overall composition and, crucially, the resulting strength level and microstructure. A 1% nickel steel could be an HSLA steel, but the defining factor is that high-strength characteristic and the associated microstructure. It just hammers home why you, as an inspector, need to understand the material's metallurgy to anticipate problems. Knowing this lets you manage risk, maybe specify preheat, choose low-hydrogen consumables, or recommend post-weld heat treatment.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, so from understanding hidden weaknesses in the material, let's talk about actually finding defects, especially those lurking inside the weld. Question 2. Internal lack of fusion defects can be normally found by using your options. A, penetrant testing, B, impact test, C, side bend test, D, hardness test. Which of these methods is your go-to for uncovering flaws that aren't on the surface?
Right. For rooting out internal lack of fusion, the most effective method from this list is definitely C, side bend test. Let's clarify what internal lack of fusion is. It's basically a subsurface flaw where the weld metal hasn't properly bonded either to the parent metal beside it or to the weld pass laid down before it. It's like a hidden gap or plane inside the weld itself.
Okay, so if it's internal, hidden away, how does bending the weld actually reveal it? It seems a bit indirect.
Ugh. But that's the clever part of a mechanical test like this. You cut a sample, a coupon from the actual weld joint. Then you bend it sideways so the side surface of the weld becomes the outer surface of the bend. As you apply the bending force, you put that outer surface under significant tension, stretching it. Now, if there's an internal lack of fusion discontinuity hiding in there, that area is weaker. The tensile stress essentially pulls it apart, forces it to open up right there on the side surface you're looking at. So the hidden flaw becomes visible because it couldn't handle the stress. It directly targets that potential weakness. Compare that to the others. Penetrant testing, A. Surface only, can't see inside. Impact tests, B. They measure toughness, how much energy the weld absorbs before breaking. A bad weld will likely fail, but it doesn't pinpoint the type or location of the internal flaw like a bend test does. And hardness tests, D. That measures a material property, its resistance to indentation. Useful, but not for finding internal gaps.
Got it. So for an inspector, choosing the right NDT or destructive test method is crucial. You can't just pick any test. You need the one designed to find the specific type of flaw you're concerned about, like lack of fusion hiding inside. All right, let's shift focus slightly. From finding problems to understanding the welding process itself, specifically the terminology. Question 3. Why is hot pass so called? The options. A, because it is applied to a high amperage. B, because it is applied when the root is still hot. C, because it could cause hot shortness. D, because it heat treats the root. Think about that name, hot pass. What does it suggest?
The name is actually very descriptive. Hot pass gets its name from option B because it is applied when the root is still hot. It's a classic example in welding where the name tells you exactly what's going on. In multipass welding, like you see often in pipe welding, you lay down the root pass first, that initial bead joining the pieces. The hot pass is typically the second pass, and it's applied pretty quickly after the root, while that whole area, the root pass and the adjacent base metal, is still significantly hot from the first pass.
Oh, okay. So it's literally about the timing and the residual heat. What's the big advantage of doing that? Why lay down the next pass while things are still hot?
Well, there are several really important metallurgical reasons. That residual heat, maybe still, 100, 150 degrees Celsius or even higher, does a few critical things. First, it really helps drive out any hydrogen that might have been picked up and trapped in the root pass. We just talked about hydrogen cracking. This helps prevent it. Second, that heat input can actually help refine the grain structure of root pass somewhat, improving its properties. And third, the overall higher temperature improves the fluidity of the hot pass weld pool itself, promoting better fusion. It helps ensure you get good tie-in to the root and sidewalls, potentially burning out any tiny imperfections left from the root pass. So it's a strategic step for quality. Option A, high amperage, might be used, but that's a parameter, not the reason for the name. Hot shortness, C, is a type of cracking that happens at high temperatures, usually due to things like sulfur. It's a defect, not a process step. And while the hot pass does apply heat D, calling it heat treating isn't really accurate in the formal sense. Its main functions are hydrogen removal and ensuring good fusion. Simple name, crucial step.
It really is striking how practical the terminology often is in welding. It directly reflects what's happening. Okay, moving on. Let's tackle another common defect. Porosity. Question 4. Porosity would mostly occur in which of the following? Choices are A, when MMA welding semi-deoxidized steel. B, when MIG-MAG welding fully deoxidized steel. C, when TIG welding non-deoxidized steel. D, when sub-arc welding semi-killed steel. Think about where gas bubbles are most likely to get trapped in the solidifying weld.
Porosity is most likely, based on these options, in C, when TIG welding non-deoxidized steel. To understand this, we need to remember what porosity is, basically. Trapped gas bubbles, little voids in the weld metal. These gases can come from anywhere: contamination, moisture, shielding gas issues, or reactions within the weld pool itself. Now, TIG welding, gas tungsten arc welding, it's known for being very clean, very precise. It uses an inert shielding gas like argon, and often very little or no fluxing agents are involved unless you're using specific filler wires.
Right, TIG is usually the clean process. So why would using non-deoxidized steel suddenly make it prone to porosity? That sounds a little counterintuitive.
It does, but that's the key interaction. Non-deoxidized steels, sometimes called rim steels, they inherently contain higher levels of dissolved oxygen and other impurities left over from the steelmaking process. In most other welding processes, MMA, stick, MIG-MAG, sub-arc, you have deoxidizers present. They might be in the electrode coating, the flux core of the wire, or the granular flux itself. These deoxidizers grab onto the oxygen and impurities in the molten pool, forming compounds that float out into the slag, effectively cleaning the weld metal as it solidifies. But with standard TIG welding on non-deoxidized steel, you often don't have those strong deoxidizing agents present in the arc or filler. So the oxygen and other impurities already in the base metal get liberated in the heat of the arc, react, form gases like carbon monoxide, and because there's nothing to effectively remove them, they get trapped as the weld freezes. Boom, porosity. It really shows that your process choice has to match your material. Trying to TIG weld dirty, non-deoxidized steel without taking specific countermeasures is asking for trouble.
That's a great point. The synergy, or lack thereof, between the process and the material is absolutely critical. It really underscores the importance of both material selection and process control way before you even strike an arc. Okay, last question for this session, focusing on process parameters again. Question 5. During CO2 welding, the arc length is most likely to be affected by: is it A, the wire diameter, B, the current return connection, C, the gas flow rate, or D, the torch to work angle? This gets into the nitty-gritty of controlling a GMAW arc.
Yeah, this is fundamental stuff for GMAW, which includes CO2 welding. The factor most likely to directly affect the arc length from this list is A, the wire diameter. It's a really key relationship in constant voltage GMAW processes. The machine is set to maintain a particular voltage, and it achieves that essentially by adjusting the wire feed speed to keep the arc length stable based on how fast the wire is melting, the burn-off rate.
Okay, I get that the machine controls wire feed speed and voltage, but how does the diameter of the wire itself directly play into the length of the arc? Can you connect those dots a bit more?
Sure. Think about electrical resistance. A smaller diameter wire has more resistance per inch or per millimeter than a larger diameter wire. So for the same amount of welding current trying to flow through it, the smaller wire heats up faster and melts more readily. The power source is trying to maintain a set voltage across the arc. It adjusts the wire feed speed to balance the melting rate. If you change the wire diameter without adjusting anything else, that balance is thrown off. A smaller wire might burn back too quickly, leading to a longer, less stable arc, or the system might struggle to feed it fast enough. A larger wire might need more current to melt properly at a given voltage and feed speed, potentially leading to stubbing and a short arc. So the wire diameter is intrinsically linked to the current required for a stable burn-off at a specific voltage and wire feed speed setting, which directly dictates the resulting arc length. It's a primary variable in that equation. The other things matter, of course. A bad current return, B, affects the whole circuit stability. Gas flow rate, C, is vital for shielding. Torch angle, D, affects bead shape and penetration. But the wire diameter has the most direct fundamental impact on how the arc length behaves in relation to the machine settings.
That's really clear now. It shows how something seemingly simple, like the wire size you choose, has a really profound effect on the whole stability and outcome of the welding process. It needs careful consideration. Wow, what a session. We've really unpacked quite a bit there. We looked at the tricky nature of hydrogen cracking in high-strength steels, how a side bend test cleverly reveals internal flaws, the simple logic behind the name hot pass, why TIG and non-deoxidized steel can be a bad mix for porosity, and just now, how wire diameter is fundamental to arc length control in GMAW. These are exactly the kinds of critical insights that really take you from just knowing an answer to truly understanding why it's the answer.
Couldn't agree more. And connecting it back to the bigger picture. Look, mastering these specific points, it's not just about ticking boxes on an exam paper. It's about building this really solid foundation of understanding. That's what empowers you as an inspector to make smart, informed decisions out in the field. Having the ability to anticipate potential problems based on the material or the process, knowing why a defect might occur and how to look for it, that's what real expertise looks like. It's about ensuring safety, ensuring quality, preventing failures. That's the real value.
Absolutely. A really powerful way to end it.
Yeah.
So for everyone listening, what really stood out to you from today's deep dive, and maybe think about this, how could understanding one of these principles in theory, say the mechanism of porosity, actually help you troubleshoot a problem you might see on a job site tomorrow? Keep those thoughts percolating. We'll be back soon with more in this series. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.